The concept I'm going to talk about today affects one of the 3 console manufacturers on the market right now, and I'm going to get into it a little bit more, but I want you to understand this. What I'm talking about right now isn't backwards compatibility. It's a completely different concept. Backwards compatibility is having some new piece of hardware play older video games, but what I'm talking about is a concept I've kind of come up with because I don't think anyone's ever really discussed it. And I'm going to call this concept Revisitation. Right now, the PlayStation 4 is capable of playing PlayStation 3 games, PlayStation 2 games, and PlayStation 1 games. Sure, emulation of PlayStation 3 games on the PlayStation 4 is pretty much impossible right now, at least according to Sony, but that doesn't mean that they can't find a way to make the games work by porting them over. Take, for example, The Last of Us, a game that came out on the PlayStation 3 and then was ported over to work on the PlayStation 4. Even the Xbox One has the ability to play original Xbox games and Xbox 360 games, but the reason it's capable of doing that isn't just limited because of the hardware itself running that older software, it's because of the controllers. Both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One utilize controllers that are similar to the predecessors that came before it. Take any game that was released utilizing the original PlayStation controller and a PlayStation 4 console should be able to play it because the controllers are essentially identical. They have the same kind of features, and in many cases those features have been improved tenfold, but they still retain the essential functionality that would be capable of playing those original PlayStation games through emulation. The concept of revisitation isn't about emulating older games, it's about the hardware having the controller capabilities to play those old games. And here's where you get into a problem when it comes to the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo has been around for a really long time, and they've made far more consoles than their competition. They can take the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, and even the Virtual Boy, and get those games to work on the Switch by simply remapping the buttons on the Nintendo Switch's controllers. But unfortunately, that isn't true for the other systems that Nintendo has designed, because they have controllers that are pretty much unique to each system that they were developed for, and that means that they don't have the ability to do revisitation, because the Switch lacks abilities that the other systems had, and these abilities aren't just software, they're physical. Think about the GameCube. I'm pretty sure the Nintendo Switch could run GameCube games through emulation because I think the Switch is powerful enough, but it wouldn't be able to emulate one of the hardware features that the controller had. It had 2 hybrid analog triggers that also were digital buttons. They had the ability to identify a range of pressure applied to them, and then there's a small click at the end. There are a lot of games on the GameCube that utilize those triggers, and because the Switch only has digital triggers, it doesn't have the ability to run those games unless they've been modified to run on the Switch specifically. That adds an added layer of complexity when trying to get older games on the GameCube to work on the Switch, meaning that the Switch naturally doesn't have the ability for revisitation. Unfortunately for Nintendo, it only gets worse. Like I said earlier, you could definitely play Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games, and Game Boy Advance games on the Switch because you basically have the same kind of buttons that you can utilize, but where you have issues is when you get into the DS and 3DS line. These systems utilize 2 separate screens, and the bottom screen was a touchscreen. Now unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to play these at home with the Switch docked and playing it on a big TV, but you should be able to play these games in portable mode. Unfortunately, both the top and bottom screen would have to kind of be fit in the direct center of the Switch, so it would look pretty bad. Or maybe you have one big screen to the left and one big screen to the right, and it could probably work out that way. It would be awkward looking, but at least you'd be able to run those games. But the moment you try to run them in docked mode, well, you can't do it. And then you get to the Wii. Wii games require the use of a light sensor bar, at least many of them do, and that gives the ability for the controller to identify where you're pointing at your TV. Without that light sensor bar, you can't play the majority or bulk of all the Wii games ever released. Again, like the GameCube, they could be modified to work on the Switch, but that's a larger process, and because you have to do stuff like that, it really does remove the ability for revisitation, because once the game has to be modified from an older version, then you're no longer playing the same version of the game, you're playing a port or a modified version of that game. And of course, this problem extends itself into the Wii U because the Wii U utilizes 2 different screens, and although many of the games could just remove that second screen feature, if the game utilized that second screen at any point, the game has to be drastically modified to work on the Switch. Revisitation is a huge problem that Nintendo has right now, where Sony and Microsoft can take their entire video game catalog from all of their past systems systems and bring them forward, Nintendo doesn't have that ability with their past 3 systems. Without Revisitation, they don't have an easy ability to add on to the library of Switch games, and what makes it worse is that the Switch is a portable system, and those GameCube, Wii, and even Wii U games would have been really fun to play portably if they had the ability to do so. Revisitation is a very important concept because it basically takes the entire library of these older video games and gives modern gamers a way to play them on their modern hardware. Without the ability to do so, games can be lost in time, and companies that spent millions of dollars making all these video games in the past couple of years can't bring them forward. And without the ability to do that, they've lost tons and tons of money not being able to sell older video games to their newer consumers. This was a massive problem, and one that I think is going to affect the Switch more as time goes on.